So, John Crowley, your new film, Brooklyn, is a real departure from the kinds of films that you've made in the past. Can you talk about what it was that attracted you to this material?
Sure. I found the story profoundly moving, and I think it's a really important story, not just for Ireland, but for something which expresses the nature of the relationship between Ireland and America in the middle part of the 20th century. And even though it's a very, very specific story set in, mid-50s or early 50s, by the time it plays, it has a reach which is far beyond that. And it's a small, simple story, but one which has huge scale, and felt like a really compelling, important one to get right and try and get it on a screen.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk about that story. It's all about this young woman, played by Saoirse Ronan, who comes to America in the 1950s from Ireland. She starts a new life for herself, and she's kind of pulled between these two different ways of life. How did you, as a filmmaker, find yourself in that character and in this story?
You mean personally? What connection?
Yeah, personally.
Well, I guess the first thing is, when I was in my late 20s, I moved to London to direct plays, and London was a city I knew very, very well from a young age and had always wanted to live there. But I was struck by how homesick I was. It didn't make any sense to me because I thought I was a young urban sophisticate, and I had moved there to direct a play at the National Theatre. So, I wasn't somebody who was like an economic migrant. There was nothing wrong with my life, as it were, there. And one of the things that this story does is it captures what's universal about moving to another country, which is that you're not from the country that you've moved to, obviously, and it takes a long time to settle down there. But more importantly, when you look back at what you used to refer as home, it's changed. Your relationship to that country is different, and something final has shifted in you. And that space is slightly discombobulating. You're leading us like doubleness, as it were. It's you're neither in one place nor another. And that's what's universal about the story, and that's what's particular. And I've never seen it articulated or written about in this fashion before. So I knew sort of from the inside out what that story was about, as it were. And there's something fresh to the fact that the story is from the point of view of a young woman, definitely, because a lot of the narratives about emigration tend to be from the point of view of young men, and that also made it feel like it wasn't sort of a period film, like as in something which was about another time and place, that it had an emotional immediacy that if we had the right actor, we would be able to capture and get on the screen.
Well, let's talk about that right actor. What was it about Saoirse Ronan that made her the right Ellis?
Partly, she was, in the very best sense of the word, the obvious choice for us, because she was just approaching the exact right age as we were beginning to move towards making the film. And she had proven herself so amazingly as a young actor, in some stunning performances from Atonement on. But I don't think we had seen her give a performance which in which you could see her moving from a young adult performance up to a fully fledged heavyweight adult actress yet. She hadn't quite done that, even though it's so obvious that she was one of the best actors working anywhere. And also she had never played an Irish role, interestingly. And so it felt like this was the exact right thing at the right time for her. Where I suppose you could say we kind of got lucky in terms of, the amount of depth she brought to the performance, was in the time between me meeting her to discuss the role and when we actually got to shoot it, which was a year later. She went through a lot of the same things that Eilish goes through, which is she moved away from home. She moved to London, got a flat, and got a boyfriend, had a life for a while, which was all very good and, happy making, I think, for her. But she was very struck by how homesick she was. And it made no more sense to her than it had to me all those years earlier. And we had lunch about 2 weeks before we were due to start shooting. And I remember her asking me, does it get easier? And she was in a place which was very raw when we were shooting it, and the emotion that's in Ailish was fully available to her day by day as we were shooting that film. So in that sense, you know, we found a young actor who had such an intuitive understanding of what her character was going through, that there were some days on set she used to say to me, you know, I don't feel like I'm doing enough. Is it okay? You know, I don't feel like I'm acting enough. And you know, you look at that film and you think, yeah, it's fine. You're doing plenty. But what I mean to illustrate by that was that she was so close to the character. She felt that she almost had no distance from her, and it felt like open heart surgery to her day after day. And she had no sense of whether she was doing good acting or bad acting. So, you know,
Right.
she
Well, there's also
assured that she was doing some very, very fine acting indeed.
Mhm. Well, there's also just so many little character things that lend it a sense of authenticity, and you know, really kind of emphasizes fish out of water element to her moving to Brooklyn. You know, for instance, the scene in Coney Island where she doesn't know to put on her bathing suit under her clothing, you know, because that's something that she'd never done before. Can you talk about like finding those little things? Were they in the script or in the book, or do they come about from research? Or
no, a lot of those were in the book, and you know that the book builds its case very slowly through like lots of acquired details, and in lots of ways the book and now the film is about pairs. You know, there's a sort of equal and opposite scene for in Ireland and in America, and the doubleness that I was talking about is sort of expressed through that. You know, but what I love about what Nick held on to in the screenplay, which is it was in the novel, was he had a very good sense to not over dramatize this story, and he trusted that actually it was all about a slow incremental build of emotion through character, and it's properly character led in a way that a lot of people say, oh, a film is character led. No, this really is character led, because in lots of ways there's no villains, there's no baddie. I mean, there's the old shopkeeper Nettles Kelly, who's a little bit mean, but there isn't a traditional baddie in the film. You're just watching a young woman who's just unfurling, and who is a rather beautiful young character who is you know, meeting events in life, and they're forming her and happening to her in a way that actually lots of people would say is undramatic, but I think it's anything but undramatic to watch it. And it's the gap between what feels like real life and what we have been told by movies should feel like real life, which is to say it doesn't succumb to a movie view of the world, even though it's profoundly romantic. It's about the slow build of emotion, so that you wind up feeling exactly what she's feeling. And when we were approaching it, I did know that from the start, the thing that would make it work or not work would be for this film to be directly emotional to the viewer. Never sentimental, but directly emotional. And that your relationship to Ailish had to be immediate and vivid from the very first frame of the film. And if we could do that, we'd have a shot at something which would be very moving to watch. But it had to be the opposite of anything sort of indie or cool or ironic or detached. You know, you had to be right in there with her. In lots of ways, it's a film about a face.
mm-hmm. And there is a real feeling of kind of classic filmmaking to the style. Can you talk about working with your department heads in creating that style?
Yeah. I mean, the idea behind the way the aesthetic of the film develops sort of internally, as it were, is that it's almost gently artless at the start. There's quite a bit of very gentle, unobtrusive handheld work. And as she leaves the small town and goes to America, so the horizon of the film actually expands, and the color scheme of the film loosens up more. And as she develops as a character, the style of filmmaking becomes more classical in a sort of gentle, hopefully unself-conscious nod to films from the period, basically. And then it's at its apex when she returns home to Ireland, and you have that section where it's slightly dreamlike, because she's not quite leading her own life yet. She hasn't told anybody about what's happened in America. She sits into her sister's job, and you know, the colors, the vividness, everything about it there is a bit drifty and dreamy. So that was something which emerged through conversation with Yves Belanger, our DP, as we were going around looking at all the locations. One of the things that excited me in particular about Yves was from Dallas Buyers Club, which he shot so wonderfully, completely different style of film, obviously, but you could tell he was the most wonderful camera operator because he would get excited about an actor's face. And one of the first sort of visual decisions that I'd made about the film was that it wasn't going to be shot in widescreen, was that the aspect ratio had to be gentle on the human face, because I knew that the proximity to the character was going to be everything. And that, so when we were actually shooting on set, there was a sort of wonderful three-way dance between directing Saoirse and then Yves responding to what she would throw up from take to take that would throw up, that would show up in his eyepiece, as it were. And that was one of the most satisfying aspects of the whole process for me.
Mm-hmm. And I'm sure you did a ton of research leading up to, you know, designing the sets and the costumes. Can you talk about some of the places that you looked for sort of visual references?
Endless websites, endless books of photography from the period, occasional film references, but on the proviso that we were never playing a game of spot the film reference. You know, that it would never be, you would never be directed to another cinematic expression of something. Because what's kind of complicated about the period is you're dealing with, especially in the boarding house in America, you're dealing with young women who are watching a lot of films of the period, and in lots of ways are making their fashion choices based on that. And what was difficult for Odile, and she pulled off really stylishly, was making sure that those clothes were always clothes, that they were never costumes, because the 50s is such a wonderful gift of a period. And yet where we were at in 1951 going into 1952 is it's just before what we think of as the 50s in America had sort of found its mojo, as it were. You know, it's before rock and roll. In lots of ways, the world of that Irish boarding house is a world of sort of maybe even pre-Second World War, though, you know, that you're dealing with environments that haven't changed for 10 years, maybe more. And the reason why she's renting out rooms to the girls is because of an economic necessity, you know. So it was somehow about how we would be able to have our cake and eat it, which is just to allow just the right amount of color and glamour into those costumes without it ever feeling like we had landed into a movie, that they had to feel like these were young women who had disposable income that they would never have had back in Ireland. So, and with the color schemes, it was just all about working it out from the background to the foreground, as it were, so that they would blend and that the exact right effect would happen. And we chose our scenes where we would go really vivid, like Coney Island is one where it's sort of at its loosest and poppiest, and you've got Bing Crosby singing in the background, and it's all there. You know, that's where everything is sort of at its apex. But up until then, there would be occasional stabs of color would come through from a very vivid character, like Georgina, the young woman she meets on the boat when she's coming over. But we kept quite a tight rein on everything. But the other approach, which was really crucial, was having done all the research on the period, we then threw it away, as it were, which is that the frames never foregrounded the art direction. And that the art direction was assumed to be as brilliant as it was and was allowed to be in the background of frames, because it was always going to be a film about a face first, and that the environment in the 50s would creep in to the background of those frames in a way that you would feel it, and that it would somehow, hopefully that way, feel more authentic and also never feel like it was a period film with a capital P, where you come out whistling the scenery, as it were, you know.
Right. Can you talk a bit about finding some of those other faces, you know, the other actors in the film, and finding a group that could mesh well together?
Yeah. So, you know, any casting process is a long, careful one, and you're sort of building a mosaic that you put one piece in place, and Saoirse was first. Mm-hmm. Donald Gleeson was second, you know, a brilliant actor who I'd seen on stage many years ago and had been a fan of him since then and watched his film career taking off. And we were lucky indeed that he's at the point where he didn't necessarily need to play this part, that he was willing to take it on, because he gave Jim such a depth and a subtlety to it. And Emery took a while to find, Tony rather took a while to find before we found Emery. He put himself on tape in America, and I think good suggestion, the casting director, who, you know, and we had seen him in Place Beyond the Pines, but I had no idea that he could do anything as delicate as this. And that was a tricky part to cast, to find the right element of somebody who was believably a plumber in the 50s, but also, you know, Italian American, but also has a sort of sensitivity to him and a sweetness to him, which was needed for the character. Then with all the other parts in terms of the girls in the boarding house and people she works with and everything, it was bit by bit. It was literally meeting lots of wonderful stage actors oftentimes and making sure that they had the wit and playfulness and cattiness, and that they could see the full extent of what was in the screenplay in terms of the of gentle irony that we could pull out, because, you know, there's plenty of sadness in the film, and the humor was incredibly important, and especially if you've got, you know, actors like Julie Walters or Jim Broadbent, who are just, you know, comic masters. You had to have young actors who were able to really vividly, in a short number of scenes, realize those characters. So it was a really pleasurable casting process, because, you know, it's wonderful writing, and when you're meeting young actors, we were sort of spoiled for choice, really, between America and Canada and Ireland with all of those characters, and bit by bit we built up this, like I say, like a mosaic, where every last part was rather lovingly and carefully cast.
Right. You know, this film really does hold a lot of relevance to today, even though the events take place about 60 years ago, you know, because the story is so universal. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah. I think it is universal because of how specific we've rendered it, as it were. I mean, when we were making it, you know, the migrant crisis wasn't in any way as extreme as it is now, that we're experiencing over in Europe with Syria and everything. But mass migration has never gone away. You know, and in lots of ways, the period that you know, this is set in a very, very specific time and place about a very specific chunk of Irish history, which is the vast number of young people that left the country in the 50s. Much to the shame of the government, who sort of, almost at times it seemed, treated it as a way of keeping the unemployment figures down. And for a story to have a shot at being universal, you know, we had to resist the urge to nudge any images or any elements in the film towards something contemporary, you know, because that would have simply ripped the fabric of something, and you would have wound up doing neither. But it's striking to me that huge numbers of people who watch the film are immediately reminded of immigrants from vastly different cultural backgrounds. And it is a subject matter which, as we know, creates very strong reactions in people. And, you know, I think that part of the intention behind the original impulse of Colm to Bean to write the novel was something that you could say is political with a small p, which is that if you're moved by Eilish's journey in the film, in some sense that's a humanizing act, because somebody who is previously part of a group or a band, which is just a migrant, an immigrant, a statistic, you know, the film suggests it's not easy. Actually, it's very, very difficult. And somebody who feels that homesick and that lonely, and who does not have to go through extreme hardship other than getting on with their daily life, that's a very important point to be made in a lot of areas now.
Right. Well, thank you so much, and congratulations on the film.
Thank you. Nice talking to you.
Great talking to you too. Thank you.
Best. Bye.
Bye.